welcome to our second video in the Field of Cloth of Gold 500 Virtual Summit Extravaganza. I hope you've enjoyed the talks so far. We're now going to take a different tack and hear a talk by Tracy Borman about Henry VIII and some of the influential courtiers who attended the event. As many of you will no doubt know, Tracy is a best-selling author and historian, and she specialises in the Tudor period. Her books include Elizabeth's Women, which was Book of the Week on Radio 4 here in the UK, Thomas Cromwell, The Untold Story of Henry VIII's Most Faithful Servant, which was a Sunday Times bestseller again here in the UK, The Private Lives of the Tudors, and then most recently Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him, which is the focus of this talk. Tracy is the Joint Chief Curator of Historic Royal Palaces and a regular broadcaster. She has presented 3 series for Yesterday TV, inspired by her research into the private lives of people from the past, and has also appeared in the very popular Channel 5's Inside the Tower of London. So without further ado, let's go over to listen to what Tracy has to tell us about Henry VIII and his men.
Hello, I'm Tracy Borman and I'm delighted to be taking part in this Field of Cloth of Gold Summit in, of course, the 500th anniversary year. Well, we're going to be doing lots to celebrate this remarkable anniversary at Hampton Court Palace, where I work as Joint Chief Curator for half of my time when I'm not writing books. And it's one of those books that I'd like to tell you about today, and in particular, the references to this incredible event in June 1520. Well, the book is called Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him. And even though I've been a Tudor historian for quite a number of years now, this is my first book when I tackled the big man. I took on Henry for the first time. Why haven't I written a biography of him before? Well, to be frank, there are quite a few of them around, and I wanted to be sure that I had something genuinely new and different to say. Well, when you say the name Henry VIII, you do tend to think of those 6 wives. It's the ladies in his life who have dominated the headlines, making him by far, I think, our most famous king, as well as, of course, our most married king. But what about the men? This was a question that increasingly occurred to me. What about those men in Henry's life? Well, the more I researched the men who surrounded Henry, not just in his years as king, but before that as well, the more I realised this was a really, really fascinating story to tell. And it gives us a very different impression of Henry. I have to say, I found him a lot more likeable, a lot more sympathetic by the end of my research than I had before then. Well, my book covers literally hundreds of men, so I'm not going to talk to you about all of them today. What I've done is just to cherry pick a few who I think are the most fascinating, either in and of themselves or in what they reveal about Henry VIII. And as I said, I'm going to be making particular mention to the Field of Cloth of Gold as well. Well, arguably the most important man in Henry's life was his father, Henry VII. But at the time of Henry's birth in 1491, Henry VII already had a son and heir, Arthur, born suspiciously just 8 months after his wedding to Elizabeth of York. And I show you a picture of the 2 brothers here, Arthur and his younger brother, Henry. Well, what did this mean for Henry? What it meant was greater freedom, because as just the spare heir, of course, he was still very, very useful to his father, but he was allowed greater freedoms. He was allowed to indulge his pleasures and pastimes and was raised separately to his elder brother Arthur, largely at Eltham Palace, very much associated with his maternal grandfather, Edward IV. And during Henry's early childhood, really, his father was little more than a distant figure, which was sort of typical for a royal offspring. They tended to be raised in separate apartments or separate palaces, even to their parents. But I think there was more to it than that for Prince Henry, because his father very much focused his attention on his elder brother, Arthur. But then, of course, disaster struck in 1502 when the 15-year-old Prince Arthur suddenly died. Now, it was a double disaster because, as well as losing his eldest son and heir, the boy whom he had shaped into a future king, Henry VII also stood to lose his great alliance with Spain, because Arthur had only recently married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the mighty Ferdinand and Isabella. So now it looked like this alliance may well just lay in tatters. So it was a catastrophe, but at least Henry VII had another son in the shape of Prince Henry, our future Henry VIII. But he was already almost 11 years old at the time that his brother died. And by then, really, his character was pretty much fatally set, as that indulged spare heir allowed his freedoms, allowed his pastimes. And now Henry VII had work to do in sort of chiselling his younger son into the future king that he wanted him to be. So here you see a picture of the aged Henry VII, and now this is the man whom Henry VIII, the future Henry VIII, saw an awful lot more of, because he was moved to his father's palace at Richmond. All of his sort of wilder companions, men such as Charles Brandon, were replaced by more sober advisors that his father had appointed, and life was now very, very different for the future Henry VIII. Much as he gloried in his role as an heir in waiting and in all the attention that that brought with it, he didn't like this new suffocating influence that he was now subject to from his father, particularly as well as losing his favourite companions. His father was restricting his activities that had always given him pleasure, such as jousting and other vigorous, quite dangerous sports, far too dangerous for an heir in waiting. So now he wasn't allowed any of that, and he had to just focus on the much more serious business of training to be a future king. Well, relations between father and son grew increasingly stormy, to say the least. And on one occasion, a scandalised Spanish ambassador reported it looked this evening as if the king might murder his son. They managed not to murder each other. Henry VII died a natural death, of course, in April 1509, leaving his throne to his only surviving son, who was now Henry VIII, aged 17. Everything was now one long festival at court as Henry tried to prove just how different he was to his late father, who in his latter years had become deeply unpopular, very paranoid, suspicious, miserly. So, of course, Henry set out to be everything his father had not been. He dismissed many of his father's old attendants and ministers. He executed two of them, the despised Empson and Dudley, and he replaced them with a court filled with his own favourites. Well, he also laid on very lavish entertainments. He spent an enormous amount of money in entertaining those who visited his early court. And so really, it was with good reason that it was described as being really one long party, to paraphrase some of the contemporary descriptions. And Henry himself would spend days on end just hunting, playing, doing jousting, playing card games. Whatever gave him and his court pleasure was what Henry now would indulge in. That's all very well, but there is the small matter of running the country. Well, that's something that Henry, despite his father's training, was not much interested in. And so he passed much of the business to a very able man who you can see here, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. He started the reign as a fairly low-ranking churchman and administrator, but he was a man of such ability, such genius really, that he rapidly rose through the ranks to become effectively, although he was never called this, Henry's chief minister. He was adored by Henry for good reason, because whatever Henry gave him to do, he did it, and he did it brilliantly. But he was despised by pretty much every other member of Henry's male-dominated court because, as well as being jealous of the power of the man that people were whispering was the Alter Rex, or other king, they also despised him as a man of lowly birth because Wolsey was just the son of a butcher. Now that was very, very unusual in Henry's court, where positions were pretty much hereditary. They would go to the sons of noblemen and the like, whereas Wolsey was exceptional in having worked his way to the top from nowhere. Well, I think it's to Henry's credit that he appointed him on ability rather than on birth, but everybody else there serving Henry really resented the fact. Well, a high point in Wolsey's career came in 1520 when he helped to mastermind the spectacular showpiece, which is illustrated in this amazing painting on display this year at Hampton Court, of course, the Field of Cloth of Gold. It was a 2-week meeting between Henry VIII and the King of France, Francois Premier, or Francis I, who was Henry's fiercest international rival. You can see the two kings here, and they were both renowned for their very splendid courts, for their great intellect, for being very, very cultured young kings. They were close in age, and they were both renowned for their good looks and their sporting prowess. So they were intense rivals in every single respect. Frenemies, if you like, because they always pretended, of course, that they liked to be on good terms. And that's what the Field of Cloth of Gold was all about. It was an expression of their peace and of their amity, which didn't tend to last very long between these two great kings. The undertone of the Field of Cloth of Gold was very, very clear. It didn't take a genius to work out that really each king was setting out to outdo the other in material splendour, in the lavishness of their entourage, and critically in their sporting prowess, because really there was going to be one long sporting festival during this 2-week meeting. Well, Henry knew who to put in charge of all of this, and that, of course, was Wolsey, who had served him so well in every other respect. So Wolsey was tasked with creating the most dazzling entourage ever seen, and he did so to absolutely brilliant effect. It was huge. 3,000 men accompanied Henry and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who went with him. Thousands of horses, wagons, tents, an enormous temporary palace which covered, and I have a quote here, nearly 10,000 square metres. And that was built in theory to house Henry, although actually he didn't even stay there. He stayed in a castle nearby in Guienne, but it was all for show. And Wolsey got all of the credit really for ensuring that it was his king, not France's king, that won what one historian has rather wonderfully called the Battle of the Bling between these two kings. But actually it wasn't all down to Wolsey. In fact, the whole meeting had been the idea of a man who was not yet well known, but soon would be, because he was Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne and also of her sister Mary, but also a diplomat in France. And he had suggested this spectacular meeting. And it was also an opportunity for other members of Henry's male entourage to showcase their talents, because Henry cherry-picked his very best men to accompany him, men who he knew would beat the French in the tournaments that would be taking place in the Field of Cloth of Gold. So they included, as well as Thomas Boleyn, who you have just seen, hopefully, a picture of, Henry's best friend, I think he can be called that, Charles Brandon, who had served Henry since his youth, and They had so much in common, these two men. They absolutely adored each other. They both loved hunting. They both loved women. They were great flirts. I think Brandon really led Henry astray somewhat, and Henry really adored him for it. In fact, they even looked alike, and Henry liked to trick his courtiers by ordering identical clothes for Charles Brandon so that they would sometimes get them mixed up. So Brandon went. He was a great jouster, of course, as was Sir Henry Guildford, also very well versed in the arts of chivalry. He was a very, very skillful horseman and very good at foot combat as well. So he went. And also you see here a portrait of Carew, Sir Nicholas Carew, and I think this is one of the most amazing portraits of the age. Another portrait on display, by the way, in our exhibition, Gold and Glory at Hampton Court Palace. So Henry showed off his best men and also took the men who would keep him the best company, the men he loved the most. But he also took with him men whom he wanted to keep an eye on. Talk about keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Well, that's exactly what Henry did. So they included Henry Percy, 5th Earl of Northumberland, who'd always been a bit troublesome to the king, and also this man, Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Now, he boasted royal blood and was a constant thorn in the king's side. So Henry had no intention of leaving him behind when he himself journeyed to France. So these enemies of Henry's also went with him. And you can see here in this incredible painting, The Embarkation at Dover, a sense of the scale of the operation of Henry and his entourage. You can see Henry on board one of the ships and the huge entourage that accompanied him as he sailed across the Channel to meet his great rival. And in the next slide here, you can see a detail of that incredible palace, the temporary palace that Henry and Wolsey had organised for his accommodation, even though he didn't bother to stay there. Well, another detail that you now see is Henry himself on horseback, and I have here a lovely description of how Henry was attired. You might imagine, for a man who loved clothes so much and had one of the biggest wardrobes in the world, he's really going to pull out all the stops to meet his French rival. And he was described as being dressed in a garment of such shape and making that it was marvellous to behold, fashioned from cloth of silver and damask, and ribbed with cloth of gold, so thick as might be. Well, that wouldn't have been lost on any of the eyewitnesses there. People understood the symbolism and the value of clothes. To put it into context, Elizabeth I's great favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, once spent more on a suit of clothing than Shakespeare spent on New Place, his new house in Stratford-on-Avon. So it was that kind of money that would be lavished on clothes, and everybody would have admired Henry. In fact, Henry did outshine his French rival, even though the whole occasion had been very carefully staged, managed. And I have a description from one of the best accounts of the Field of Cloth of Gold, that by Edward Hall, the famous chronicler, who described that first meeting between Henry and Francis. Well, it had all been stage managed very, very carefully so that neither king had the upper hand. In fact, there was even some landscaping going on so that when each king rode to the top of an opposing hillside, those hillsides were of exactly the same height, and so that neither king had the advantage. And then they rode down into the valley and alighted from their horses and embraced, and then, quote, with benign and courteous manner, each to the other, with sweet and goodly words of greeting. And after few words, these two noble kings went together into the rich tent of cloth of gold, arm in arm. Wow, it was all very, very harmonious, but it didn't last because the rivalry between them soon rose to the surface, and it was clear exactly what the subtext of this meeting was. Henry got a bit annoyed when Francis proved to be the greater gallant. He was very popular with all the very beautiful ladies there and went round kissing them, except for 3 or 4 old and ugly ones, we're told, charming, by one of the chroniclers. But otherwise, he was very popular with the ladies, and certainly seemed to get on very well with Henry's wife, Catherine. So you can imagine that didn't go down particularly well. So Henry, getting very fed up with all of this, one day when he'd had rather too much wine to drink, suddenly challenged Francis to a wrestling match. Well, this was completely off the agenda. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. But Henry wanted to get one over on Francis. It wasn't enough that he'd won the Battle of the Bling. He wanted to win some combat, some physical combat. And I think he really wanted to get out his aggression that he felt against the French king. Sadly, though, perhaps because of all the wine he'd been drinking, Henry was soon bested by his French rival and thrown to the ground. And he lost the wrestling, much to his annoyance and fury. And in fact, he left the Field of Cloth of Gold not long afterwards and promptly made peace with Francis's great rival, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So really the whole thing had just been an extortionate scam and really a complete showpiece with nothing to back it up. And I want to just give you some facts and figures about how much this whole thing had cost. Well, the food alone for Henry and his retinue had cost the equivalent of £2.8 million. So it was £7,409, and that is the modern equivalent, almost £3 million just for the food. So you can imagine it's a multi-million pound, sorry, we're not in America, multi-million pound meeting between the two kings. Henry had, in the run-up to the Field of Cloth of Gold, when everything was very positive and he was trying to compliment the French king, he had attempted to grow a beard. And you can see that from these two miniatures, which show Henry with a beard and then Henry clean-shaven. In fact, the beard didn't even make it to the Field of Cloth of Gold because Henry's wife, Catherine, had persuaded him to shave it off. She preferred her husband clean-shaven. But increasingly, as the 1520s wore on, poor old Catherine's opinion mattered less and less to Henry as he became absolutely obsessed with Anne Boleyn. So, of course, as I mentioned, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, who had suggested the whole meeting between Henry and the French king. Well, Henry did what he always did. He told Wolsey to go and arrange it for him. He wanted an annulment from Catherine and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The reason really he wanted to marry her was not just passion, although that was part of it, but the fact that he had no son and heir. Poor old Catherine, despite numerous pregnancies and stillbirths, had just a surviving daughter, the Princess Mary, and she was rapidly approaching the age where she could no longer give Henry children. So Anne Boleyn held out the prospect of a male heir, and that really just stoked Henry's desire for her. Well, it wasn't as easy, of course, for poor old Wolsey as many of the other tasks that Henry had given him over the years. It was particularly difficult because in order to secure an annulment for the King of England, he needed the Pope's permission. And the Pope at the time was completely dominated by Charles V, who just so happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. So you can see why Wolsey really struggled. After several years of frustrated negotiations with Rome, no further progress had been made, and in the end it was Wolsey's downfall. Anne Boleyn thought that he was deliberately obstructing her path to the throne, and she and her very powerful family, particularly her father and her brother George, began conspiring against Wolsey and persuaded the king to throw him out. So poor old Wolsey was stripped of his titles, his offices. He was forced to leave York Place, his magnificent London home, and retreat ultimately to York, where he was still Archbishop. But even that wasn't good enough for Wolsey's enemies because they didn't trust that he wasn't going to worm his way back into Henry's affections, and therefore they persuaded Henry to have him brought back to London to face charges of treason, no less. You might say poor old Wolsey had a lucky escape, if you can describe death as such, because he only made it as far south as Leicester Abbey, and there he breathed his last. Henry made no public declaration of grief or regret upon Wolsey's death. But what you always need to do, not just with Henry, but I think any subject in history, is contrast their public actions with their private ones. And that's something that has particularly interested me. I wrote a whole book on the private lives of the Tudors because you see them as they really were. And Henry admitted one of Wolsey's trusted servants, George Cavendish. Shortly after Wolsey's death, he saw him in private, and Cavendish reports that the king was absolutely heartbroken at Wolsey's death, even though he never showed it in public. And so that does give us, I think, a more sympathetic view of Henry. Well, thanks to the fact that Wolsey had really trained up a successor, perhaps not knowingly, Henry had no interruption in service to him, because into Wolsey's shoes very quickly stepped this man, Thomas Cromwell. Well, pardon the pun, but he had a lot in common with his former patron Wolsey, because he too was of lowly birth. He was merely the son of a blacksmith from Putney, very nice part of London today. It wasn't when Cromwell was born there in the late 15th century. So like Wolsey, he'd come from nowhere. He'd really got to his position just on his sheer ability alone. He was particularly skilled in law, but he was many other things besides, the true polymath that Wolsey had been. And so Henry, as I said, didn't have to suffer any interruption in his service, and he was soon served just as brilliantly, if not more so, by Cromwell as he had been by Wolsey. But I think Cromwell had a harder job of it, because Wolsey had got Henry at just the right time, when he was very young, when he was content to hand over the reins of power to someone who would just manage it all for him. But now, as the 1530s wore on, he was becoming more interested in government, more paranoid about would-be traitors. He'd had enough experience of being king to be a bit more paranoid like his father had been. And also he knew that people had called Wolsey the Alter Rex, the other king, and he didn't like it. He wanted to be the one seen to be in complete control. So he made it very clear that he would not suffer it to have anyone in his power to command me, as he once said. What this meant, though, was not that Henry's men were denied power, but they had to be a lot more subtle in trying to attain it. And I think one of the things that surprised me most in my research for this book was just how easy Henry was to be manipulated by those around him, particularly the likes of Thomas More as well as Cromwell. And you just see, really, his gullibility at times is quite astounding. They very, very often were able to pull the wool completely over his eyes. The 1530s, as they wore on, were a time of crisis for Henry. He'd finally secured his annulment from Catherine in 1533 and married Anne Boleyn, but that had all ended in tears because she'd just given him another useless daughter. What possible good could come of Elizabeth if only he had known? And then she was condemned for adultery, I think on almost certainly trumped up charges orchestrated by Cromwell, whose enemy she was, and she had been executed in May 1536. Well, Henry had very, very quickly married the lady shown in this painting, shown bottom right, who is Jane Seymour. Of course, he married her just days after Anne's death. But at the time that this painting, the Whitehall mural, it is called, was painted by Hans Holbein, who really can be called Henry's spin doctor or image maker, things were going very, very badly wrong for Henry. So not only had Anne Boleyn just been executed, but he was facing increasing opposition to his religious reforms, because in order to secure the annulment, in a theme that is rather topical today, England had had to break from the rest of Europe. We'd had to break from papal rule and establish ourselves as almost a separate entity, with a separate Church of England over which Henry was supreme head. Not all of his subjects, in fact, large numbers of his subjects were very, very unhappy with this. So he was, as I say, increasingly facing rebellion, and particularly in 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace. So things seemed to be unravelling a bit for Henry. And of course, despite marrying now 3 times, he still had no son. So he commissioned Holbein to paint this remarkable mural to decorate the walls of the now sadly lost Whitehall Palace, but thankfully a copy was made, so we know exactly what it was like. So this was supposed to be an expression of the might of the Tudor dynasty. It shows Henry not just with Jane Seymour, but with his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But it's about more than that, because what you find with Henry VIII is that his father's influence endures throughout his life. He's always a bit insecure about his father, particularly at moments of crisis when he feels the need to justify himself and prove that he's the better king, even though arguably, sorry Henry, but Henry VII was, at least on paper, the more successful of the two Henrys. So this painting shows Henry VIII larger than life. You can see him there, bottom left, standing in that very strident pose, hands on hips, legs astride. And his father, by contrast, is shown by Holbein as a rather frail man. He's having to lean on the pillar. He looks quite emaciated. And that pillar, part of the inscription reads, "The son was born to a greater destiny." So as if to hammer home that message. Well, thanks to the lady shown bottom right, Jane Seymour, the following year, 1537, Henry did at last get his heart's desire when Jane gave birth to a boy, a healthy boy, in this beautiful portrait shown here. The future Edward VI was born at Hampton Court Palace, and in fact, his nursery is now the curator's offices. So they're now where I sit on a daily basis. So it's quite a nice piece of history for me to know that. So Edward was, as you might imagine, the apple of his father's eye from the beginning. Henry called him "my precious jewel." But he became as distant a father to Edward as his own had been to him, as was entirely in keeping with royal tradition. Henry, as the 1530s wore on and into the 1540s, was increasingly plagued not just by threat of rebellion, but by poor health. He had a very bad jousting accident in 1536 whilst jousting at Greenwich, and he suffered a fall from his horse and an injury to his leg. And that injury, because of the treatment largely from Henry's physicians, became ulcerated. The accepted wisdom was to keep a wound constantly open in order to let the infection out. Of course, what it achieved was to let the infection in. And so Henry was a man plagued by pain really for the rest of his days. And you do feel very sorry for him when you read the accounts of what he's going through in private. One of the men, though, who were able to ease his suffering at least a little was the man shown here, Dr. William Butts, who was Henry's most trusted physician for more than 20 years. He served him and his family. And this is when I would say again about just looking at what's going on in private, because actually William Butts, as many of the private attendants did, exceeded his stated position. He went far beyond his duties as just a doctor and actually became an advisor and a confidant to Henry. And actually one thing that Butts was a religious radical. So you can really see how being surrounded by men like this helped to spur Henry on in his reforms. But in the 1540s, he was really suffering, and he did increasingly retreat into himself. He had a couple of disastrous marriages after Jane Seymour died shortly after giving birth to Edward. He married Anne of Cleves. That was a match set up by Thomas Cromwell. Of course, it didn't go terribly well. Henry didn't really like Anne when he met her. The marriage was soon annulled. By the way, she has always been my favourite of the six wives, because I think she's the most sensible. She gave Henry what he wanted, and she ended up with £40,000 a year and 5 palaces. So good old Anne. Well, she was followed by Catherine Howard, who was less successful, and of course she was found guilty of adultery, and that was a huge blow from which Henry never really recovered. He was devastated by his young wife's betrayal. He'd absolutely been like a teenager in love with Catherine, even though he was more than 30 years her senior, and her betrayal really cut him to the quick, and he never recovered. So he's plunged into a deep depression, increasingly retreating into himself, often just living in private, not really being seen in the public court. And that was the story of Henry in the 1540s for much of that decade. He's also surrounded by a new breed of men, because Of course, in this age where people don't live terribly long, Henry is losing all of those men who had surrounded him in his early days, particularly men such as Charles Brandon, who died in 1545. Henry was so devastated by Brandon's loss that he ordered that he be buried at the king's expense at Windsor Castle. And I think it's no coincidence that Henry chose Windsor as his own burial place a couple of years later. We tend to be told it's because the so-called favourite wife, Jane Seymour, is buried there. For a start, I don't believe she was his favourite, and I think probably Brandon was the greater influence on Henry's choice. Well, the new men were characterised by the gentleman shown here in this engraving, Anthony Denny. He was Henry VIII's last groom of the stool, should we say the most intimate of his body servants, and he had none of that loyalty that Henry's longer standing companions had had. In fact, he and his like tried to profit on the king's increasing weakness, and he did very effectively because he had charge of the privy purse, and we can see from the accounts how Denny is siphoning off some of the profits from his position, because they know that the king has lost his grip on the affairs of the court now, and they can get away with it effectively. And that's why you also see, I think, the doctoring of Henry VIII's will as he lay dying. Well, in December 1546, the aged Henry, and you can see a portrait of him here in old age, fell very dangerously ill whilst staying at Oakland's Palace in Surrey. He was unable to attend the traditional Christmas celebrations at Greenwich, and instead he retreated to Whitehall Palace with just a handful of male attendants, including Anthony Denny. The new year came in, 1547, and it was very, very obvious that there could not be long left. Henry hadn't quite finished with his men yet, though, because on the 19th of January, he sent the last of them to his execution. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, eldest son and heir of the Duke of Norfolk, who had been Thomas Cromwell's nemesis. Surrey had boasted of his royal blood, which was quite a foolish thing to do in a time of intense paranoia on Henry's part. And he does have that dubious claim to fame, as I said, of being Henry VIII's last victim. Henry had actually signed the execution warrant of Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, as well, because you're sort of tainted by association, even though Norfolk was really innocent of any crime. He'd signed with the dry stamp, he was incapable of signing anything, Norfolk's execution warrant on the 27th of January, 1547. Now, I emphasise that date because the execution wasn't carried out on the 27th of January. And on the following day, this scene happened. It is the deathbed of Henry VIII. An imagined scene. I can tell you there weren't nearly so many people there as Henry breathed his last. There certainly wasn't the Pope, who is shown at the bottom of the painting, nor was there Henry's young son, Edward. But it's really symbolic of the fact that the throne is now passing from Henry to his only son, Edward. When Henry awoke on the 28th of January 1547, very early in the morning, but it's still the night time really, it was obvious that his life was slipping very rapidly away. And that very rapacious groom of the stool, Anthony Denny, asked Henry if he would see some learned man, by whom he meant Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, effectively to make his final confession. Ironically, a very Catholic act, given everything that had gone before. Well, Henry said this: "I will first take a little sleep, and then, as I feel myself, I will think on the matter." Those were the last recorded words that Henry ever spoke, and he died shortly afterwards. Well, in this final portrait of Henry, you see him as, I guess we always remember him in the way that Holbein had created him, this image of majesty that never got any less invincible, even as Henry in private was becoming a great deal more frail. So you can see just how much influence men like Holbein had. Well, writing this book was a real journey of discovery for me, because not only did it introduce me to a quite dazzling cast of characters, some very well known, Wolsey, Cromwell, More, others far more obscure but equally influential, men, as I mentioned, like William Butts, but also it gave me a different opinion on Henry himself, because when viewed through the eyes not of the six wives for a change, but of the men who surrounded him throughout his life. It really did feel like meeting this most famous of kings for the very first time. Thanks very much.